What's going on, everybody? My name is Nick.
And my name is Dave.
And this is the Deep Dive, and we have just come through a snowy weekend here in good old Hickory Flat in Georgia. Got our first real measurable snow, I feel like, in a few years.
It's been a while. It has, yeah.
And it was a good time. I had a good time. I know you had the grandbaby with you throughout the whole thing, so there was some fun there.
Yeah, it was very pretty. It was magical, and it caused us, of course, if you probably watched online. Well, you could only watch online because we made the decision. We'll talk about that in a second.
Sure.
About canceling worship this past weekend. So let's get started with this thing.
Let's jump in. All right, Dave. Well, at the top before the intro, you kind of alluded to it. We did have a canceled in-person worship service for Sunday, but we were still able to kind of keep ticking.
Yeah, we were, and I think we're very well prepared to be online here.
Yeah.
Our team does an incredible job, and we had, looking at the forecast, had made some plans that if we needed to, we could. And so, it's always a really, really tough decision when that happens. And this happened to me a number of times over my ministerial career.
Sure.
To make the decision to do that. I was just hoping it was going to be super obvious that we should, if we had to do that, because it was sort of like, do we or don't we? And, we had to make the call pretty early too, to just make sure we got the word out. So we could have, had the people who could come and have everybody else watch online, but I think we did the right thing.
I think with the technology we have, the ability to be online, I think one of the things COVID prepared us for were Sundays like this, where when forecasts look a little dreary or whatever, that we can adapt, we can change, and I thought it went well still.
Yeah, it did. We did well. My technology on my end, during COVID, I was set up, and so I had to kind of dig everything back out, and some of my stuff wasn't working, so I just ended up doing it on my phone, which is okay. But the microphones and software that I was using, I just couldn't get it up and running, and I wanted to get finished so I could recording the sermon is what I'm talking about. So I wanted to get finished so that I can enjoy the snow too. So it was what it was, and it worked okay.
And if you didn't see, there was a special guest at the very end.
Yeah, that's right.
He pulled us together like a movie, or like one of those YouTube videos where they want you to watch all the way to the end. They're like, wait till the end to see a special guest. Tell us about your special guest.
Yeah, my granddaughter, who was born December 29th, and so they came to our house for the storm because they didn't know what was going to happen. They live around a lot of woods. They thought their power might go out. They didn't know. So they came up and have been with us. They're actually going home today, but have been here with us since Thursday. So that's been a real joy. And it was sort of magic time to have her there and to have that snow right outside the window.
Yeah.
It was very cozy, but one of my reasons for wanting to be in person, but I think it worked out okay.
Yeah.
But and kind of dragging my feet a little bit on, do we or don't we, is because I was starting a new message series, which I'm real excited about. It's going to be our winter message series. It's going to take us up right to Lent.
Yep.
And I got a couple of Sundays mixed in there, but for the most part, I think there's 6 sermons in it. And we're looking at the life of Joseph, who is really one of my heroes from the Bible. But we're just kind of looking through his stories and taking it in 6 chapters. And there's a lot to learn. I said on Sunday, it's an ancient story for sure.
Yeah.
And it's a different time and culture, which we'll get into in a minute. But it's also the problems that they had are problems that we can relate to. And it's kind of like holding up a mirror. And like I asked the question, and I'll ask it each week, where do you find yourself in the story? Is there something that you can identify and that we can learn from?
Right.
As Joseph is kind of learning some hard lessons, can we also learn them as well? So
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you kind of started with even stuff like family dysfunction and stuff like that. And I'm sure we'll go into some of those specifics, but it's interesting when you look at some of these old stories. I think especially with one like Joseph, you kind of focus on the overarching, the dreams, the codes, all this stuff. And sometimes you don't stop and kind of
These are
think about
all-
those like bits of it. It's
all of
like
these
this
people-
was dysfunction, and that
100
looks like in my world.
100%. All of these people that that get mentioned, they're some of the heroes of the Bible, and so
Yeah.
lots of times we just focus on the great attributes and not the human side of
Yeah.
them and the things that they struggled with that we can learn from. And so let's talk a little bit about that.
Sure.
And I mentioned that it was a different era, a different time. And so when you look at his parents and his grandparents and great-grandparents, it was a time when they, first of all, had multiple wives. That was the culture.
Right.
Their wives lots of times the Bible will translate them handmaidens, but they were servants. They were slaves that they had. And they would have wives, they'd have children with all of them.
Right.
And so, that you have to kind of put that baggage out there. And also just the way that they thought about women. For example, when we get into Joseph's 12 brothers, I'm sure out of all those babies they were having, there were some girls in the mix.
Some sisters somewhere in there.
And there was only one sister who's mentioned. That's because of
Right.
a story that happens. But, so it was that time. But Joseph comes from a great heritage of people.
Yeah.
His great-grandfather was Abraham. Abraham and Sarah were his great-grandparents. And so then Abraham's his grandfather was Isaac,
Okay.
Isaac and Rebekah, and then his father was Jacob. But each one of those, at every branch on that family tree, there was dysfunction, and they were not perfect people. They
Right.
made mistakes. They did some bad things,
Right.
and that should help us because our families aren't perfect either, right?
That's right.
Nobody's family is perfect. I told a story about getting one of those Christmas letters that you get, and generally I like those.
Yeah.
I like to get the updates, but every once in a while, you'll get that over-the-top one where everything is just perfect. It's just
Almost feels a little pretentious. Or,
it feels pretentious, and it makes
Yeah.
you feel like, what's wrong with my family? But their family isn't perfect either.
Sure.
And then they got some stuff they want to celebrate. That's okay. And so, but just skipping through, and not saying too much, I gave a little bit more on Sunday, but just the grandparents and the great-grandparents and their dysfunction. We get into his family, his immediate family that he grew up in, Joseph, our hero.
Yep.
And he had famously 12 brothers and sisters. There's, of course, the musical Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat.
Dreamcoat.
His different sons. His father, Jacob, had 12 sons from 4 different women.
Yeah.
But his favorite wife, and there's a story there too.
Yeah.
But his favorite wife was Rachel. Also, your favorite wife.
My only wife for those listening.
But and so she actually had 2 sons, but he was the first one born. He and Benjamin were from her. She had trouble having children, and so had him, and he was the favorite, and it was obvious that he was the favorite. And he gave them famously this coat of many colors, or
Right.
robe of many colors. And so the other brothers just hated him because he was the favorite.
Jealousy, all that good stuff.
And so one of the points that I made was that favoritism, whether it's in our families, sometimes we have it at work, in our workplaces. There's people that's favorites there, and you try to treat everybody equal, but when favoritism is there, people can smell it and see it. And then, in communities, sometimes there's people that are favored over, one person over another. And so that always breeds division.
Yeah.
And that division is going to lead to bad stuff. This favoritism that gets sown in here.
Right.
And so his brothers really kind of have it out for him. At the same time, Joseph is a young person, and I think you mentioned the dreams.
Yeah.
Just go. So Joseph was a very gifted young man.
Yeah.
God had granted him a lot of gifts, and those gifts are going to come into play as we get deeper into the story over the coming weeks. But early on, he was very immature about it.
Yeah.
And he had these dreams where one of them was about these stalks of grain, and like one stalk was standing upright and the other stalks were bowing down and worshiped to that stalk. And then another one he talked about like the sun and the planets or something, and they were there was anyway, and both of these dreams that he had, his brothers are worshiping him, are
Right.
bowing down to him as a king. And so Joseph, at this point in the story, is very full of himself.
Yeah.
And he also has not realized that the gifts that God has given us, they're meant to serve others, not elevate ourselves. And he was using it to elevate himself.
Right.
And he wasn't building bridges, he was putting up walls with his brothers.
Yeah.
And so, so there's all this dysfunction, and it's leading to a bad place, and we're going to get into it this coming week.
Yeah.
But one thing that I talked about was that oftentimes in families, when there's dysfunction, and there's dysfunction with every family, there's strained relationships within every family, we get into this habit of playing this game called the blame game.
Yeah.
Lots of times within every family, there's a scapegoat. It's always this person's fault, right?
Yeah. The
Yeah.
black sheep type person,
Black sheep,
maybe,
yeah.
or, just somebody's always like, oh, yeah, they're the screw up or whatever.
Yeah, and we do this thing of where, that, I am the way that I am. It's not really my fault because of my parents or
Yeah,
because,
that's true.
I know I'm being bad, but my brother, you don't understand. So we use that to legitimatize our faith, our actions. We think somehow or another because this other person, we can blame them, and it gets us off. And so the brothers are to blame as well, even though it looks like, from looking on the outside, it kind of looks like, well, they're really the victims here because their father's playing favorites and their brother's being a jerk.
Yeah.
But they were giving into bitterness, and one of the points that I made was that bitterness is a poison that hurts the one holding it.
That's true.
Sometimes that anger, that bitterness can feel very powerful.
Yeah.
But while Jacob's favoritisms and Joseph's pride played a part in this family dysfunction, the brothers responded with bitterness and hatred. And so instead of addressing those feelings in a healthy way, they allowed the resentment to grow. And eventually, this next week, we're going to see how it leads to betrayal. And so,
Yeah, you talk about bitterness, and it's something that kind of festers. It's something that kind of grows and can really kind of be like toxic within. How would you encourage somebody? Maybe there's somebody out there who's feeling bitter, like they can taste this, like it's on the edges. And I can admit there's been times in my life where I have felt bitter about things. But what piece of advice might you give somebody who might be feeling bitter of how to kind of release that and to let that go?
yeah, much easier to say than it is to
Do. Sure.
Much easier to recognize in others than it is to recognize ourselves.
Yeah.
I think it starts with self-awareness.
Sure.
When you're in this strained relationship, I think a good question to ask is like, well, is there any of this is my fault?
Yeah.
What percentage of this do I own?
Some ownership.
Yeah, and it's very hard to do that.
Yeah.
And you might say, oh, well, okay, 5 or 10%, maybe it's 90%. Well, you can work on your 5 or 10%. You cannot change the other person.
Sure.
Only God can do that. Only their own self-awareness can help them. So you can change your attitude. You can not hold on to the bitterness. You're not going to let those kinds of bitterness and anger and that stuff control you.
Yeah.
And so sometimes that takes therapy. Sometimes I think just the self-awareness of it, taking a beat, taking a breath. And of course, we rely on our faith.
Yeah.
One of the scriptures which I actually have right here, once again, this is much easier to say than to do.
Sure.
But from Ephesians was one of the texts that I read.
Yeah.
Said, get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you. So that's the standard that we try to
Live up to.
Live up to, and it's hard.
It is.
It's hard, but I think the first step is just confession, the self-awareness.
Yeah.
And do you have any advice on that?
I don't know that I have anything crazy wise or any sage words necessarily, but I think you hit the nail on the head when you said that, like, you have to first address your part in it, because honestly, that's the only part you can control. You can be so mad at somebody, and it might take years for them to realize how they've wronged you. But the more that you let those things stay for those years, it's impacting you just as much as it could impact them eventually. And if we're people who are trying to live in the forgiveness, but also be able to kind of shed this malice, this anger and stuff like that, we just can't hold on to it.
Yeah.
We have to say, like, that person has their things. And honestly, for healing, that might mean putting up some boundaries for a while with that person. There's a lot of things. It kind of just depends on the situation in some of these areas.
We can't make our behavior and our own self expression be contingent on what that other person does or does not do.
Right.
And I think that's a trap we get into, because I think there's times in my life, and I've also watched other congregation members who will have the best of intentions.
Yeah.
They would have heard a sermon like this, or they've been in a Bible study, or they just have something that moves in their life, and they say, well, I'm going to reconcile with my brother or my sister or my parent or whatever, this person they're estranged from. And they have all sorts of great intentions, but that other person didn't have anything to do with it.
Yeah.
They're mad, they're angry, and they're bitter. They probably, they're looking from a completely different perspective on whatever the issue was. And sometimes we can come off, I think, self-righteous or whatever. So we have to, it's a delicate line to walk to get to that point. But I think, the first steps are, confession, self-awareness, and begin changing our attitude and action. And once the other person sees that change, then maybe, or maybe not, there might be change in their life.
Sure.
But hopefully there will be.
Yeah. I give Rachel a lot of credit for something she says a lot to our girls, and it's a lot about who's in control of you, and the answer is you, obviously. Like,
right.
you are the person that's in control, and we remind our girls that a lot, especially when they're frustrated with each other, or maybe one of us, or one of their friends, or something like that. It's like, who's in charge of your feelings?
Yeah.
You are in charge of how you feel. You can't control how those people feel or how they are acting. You know what I mean? So
that's super. That's a great point.
Yeah.
Super. I think, and also in relationships, the closer that we are to someone, the better we know them. I think the more we know how to punch their buttons, and they know how to punch ours.
For sure.
And so in sibling relationships in particular, or family relationships, you see that's where the dysfunction is. That person may do something that just drives you crazy, and they may be doing it intentionally or not intentionally. But I think it's just kind of the growth and acceptance of the other person, but also learning in healthy ways how to say, hey, please don't do that. I don't like it when you tease me in this way.
Right.
It's not funny to me. It hurts me. And so, helping to draw the line. The other person may not mean anything by it, and it might be like, oh, you're just being overly sensitive or whatever. And maybe we are being overly sensitive. But I think it's just that personal growth in relationships to understand how people are wired up and how they work. Because we're all different, and we're all imperfect.
Right.
Yeah.
It's true.
So anyway, so I sort of wound up this first sermon sort of challenging us, with some of how we find ourselves in the story.
Yeah.
And the good news is that even though we've looked at some of the downside of Jacob and of Joseph and some of them, God is at work in this story. And so when we see the big picture, we see how God's going to work this out for redemption and hope. Right. As we move through the story, and how Joseph is going to grow. So that's good news for us too, is that we don't have to stay the same way that we are, that we can change and we can grow and we can develop and we can become more like the person God wants us to be.
Right.
And so, we holding up this Ephesians text that's the ideal, then how do we respond? Well, we love one another, even those we find difficult to love.
Yeah.
And some people are difficult to love.
Yeah, and you've said a lot, or a couple times, these are harder things, or it's easier to say, of these changes you need to make than it is to do them. But that's kind of the beauty of what we see a lot in Scripture are people who aren't perfect, but they're working through these processes, these hardships, these trials, whatever you want to call them, and they are becoming people who are better at forgiveness. They're becoming people who are more easily able to hand over their fears, wants, desires to God. Like these aren't people who started in a space where they were just like, oh yeah, they read the verse or they were told they went, perfect, I'm ready, I'm done. You know what I mean? Like I'm full in. But these are people who kind of built up through their lives, and I think that's what we'll see a lot.
Right,
in
yeah,
Joseph's life.
and what we don't see lots of times in Scripture is the passage of time.
Right, the process.
You don't have the time, and not to get ahead of ourselves, but I mean, Joseph's going to sit in prison for a while.
Yeah.
And so the processing that he does there, he was a slave for a while in another person's house for a while.
Yeah.
And the process of thinking back over mistakes he's made. And so, 7 years, 14 years, whatever the time might be,
Right.
There's a maturing that goes on there that only time can teach.
Sure.
And so we think, well, all right, we made this decision. Next week, everything should be perfect.
Yeah.
It may take years. It may take a lifetime to get to that point.
That's important to understand is that a lot of this is we're capturing like the Cliff Notes version of these people's lives and their story. These little highlight points or kind of these spots that kind of tell a little bit about the story, but it's not the everyday for these guys.
And so when I say, as I will say, walk in humility and serve others selflessly, that's a process to get to.
Right.
Let go of anger and bitterness. That's a lifetime process.
Yep.
And extend grace and acceptance to everyone.
Yep.
Don't treat people with partiality. Again, that's a process to get to. But one thing about these stories is we can see how they end, and we can see that God is at work if we just keeping on.
Right.
God is with us.
Yep.
It's one of the first verses from the Scripture I'm going to read this weekend. Is God was with Joseph. Despite all that happened, God was with us. Even though bad things were happening, God was with him. And so being able to recognize God in the pain, in the journey, then I think we can begin to recognize how we can react and change and develop over time.
For sure.
Yeah.
Well, Dave, I think we are right here at about time, and I think this is a good spot to kind of close. Is there any last things you need to add here?
No, this week we're going to look at how it went off the rails.
Yeah.
And so we kind of set it up last week, and maybe some of the why it went off the rails.
Yeah.
But this week we're going to look at it going off the rails. But it's a great story. It'd be fun to work through.
It's a good story to kind of walk through, process through, work through ourselves, and all that good stuff. I think I said work through like 5 times there. Sorry.
Yeah.
But anyway. Without any further ado, you guys know that we love to just be in constant communication and interaction when it comes to the podcast. So if there's any bit of this that maybe tugs on a little bit of a heartstring or that made you kind of think of maybe some bitterness that you're holding or bitterness that that your family's holding, it's a process to work through, but we're encouraging you to kind of join Joseph in the ways that he was learning through this series and apply that to our lives too. Is that, in the process of life, we're all continuously growing. And it doesn't matter whether you're a 3-year-old listening to this podcast for some reason, or if you're a 83-year-old, is that you're still part of this journey somehow. You're still continuing to grow into maturity in your Christian walk and stuff like that. And this is all a part of that. This is all a piece of that. So join in the journey a little bit here.
And, spoiler alert, you're also going to see the brothers change by the end of the story.
That's right.
It's going to take a while to get there, but you'll see that they changed as well. One other little thing I would add is some of you know where we shoot this podcast. It's about 20 degrees in here. So if we look cold,
if you keep seeing our hands pop into our pockets and all that, that is why it is cold in here.
We're going to have to get a space heater
our
in it.
podcast area is like the Four Seasons. Whatever it is outside, we will feel it in here for sure. But we're excited to continue this series with Joseph, and we hope you guys will kind of keep continuing to join us for it. And without further ado, we'll catch you guys next time.
God bless everybody.